Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to this week's Q&A. Looks like we got a bunch of questions this week, so let's just jump right into it. First up, the importer said that since we now have a Game Boy Advance core for the Mister, what with reasonable expectations am I hoping for next? Well, my answer is going to annoy you. The truth is, I try not to expect anything because this is an amazing project, all fueled by people that do this in their spare time. So I try to never put pressure on devs. I try not to bust chops too often about certain things. But if I had to guess, if I had to roll the dice and guess which one would be out next, I'd say maybe Sega CD. But honestly, it's just one of those things where even if a dev gets 99% done with the project, there's very often that 1% hurdle that takes forever to get across. So I don't like putting pressure on people. I don't like talking about stuff unless the developer themselves says it's ready. So sorry for kind of wimping out on my answer, but if I had to guess, I'd say that. But in all honesty, I'm just super patient, and the only thing that I do hope for, which I think is somewhat realistic to say, is that once some optical drive emulation is working in Mister, I really hope that that will start translating over to being used into different cores that require optical drive emulation. So hopefully this would open it up for other CD platforms. But once again, that's just me speculating. I really have no clue. So sorry for the meh answer to it. Over on Patreon, starting out with a question from Heinrich. Am I saying that correctly? Heinrich starts out with a bunch of very nice things. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And then has a question regarding the PS2's progressive output in combination with an older G-SCART Switch Lite. So the chain is a whole bunch of consoles, including PS2, all PAL via SCART into a G-SCART Switch Lite, and then from there into an OSSC. So from there, it goes into a DVDO iScan Duo. Awesome. That way you could conform the signal and kind of tweak it even a bit more. And it adds less than a frame of lag, which is awesome. And then into a Panasonic 1080p plasma. I had one of those. I loved it. It's the only TV I loved almost as much as the OLED. It's a great TV. Definitely hold on to that as long as you can. So the question is, how do you get PS2's progressive signal over SCART in this setup? So the easiest way, by far, no doubt at all, is to simply upgrade to the newest G-SCART switch with sync regeneration. And it looks like you have 7-8 consoles. So, if you're looking for a second G-SCART, that might actually be a pretty cool thing to think about. But if you didn't need a second G-SCART, if you would really only be replacing one with the other thing that you can do is a C-Sync mod for your PlayStation. And this is something I touched upon maybe 2 years ago when Dan Citrus 3000 PSI first kind of figured it out. And I kind of put it on pause for a while for a very long list of reasons. And I just got back into it for the Rad2X video because I needed a PlayStation that had all of the signal outputs available. So there's at least one version of the PS2 FAT where all you do is disable Luma, and it turns Luma into C-Sync across all resolutions, and you retain all other functionality. So I'm still doing some research to make sure that that's a good model to recommend. I was told that the lasers in there are kind of finicky, but you can get really good, cheap replacement lasers. So I'm kind of holding off on talking about that. But if you don't care about component video output, and you don't need composite video output, you just want C-Sync on all, you could have a modder perform this mod, and you get C-Sync on both composite video and Luma. And if you use a light gun, which I don't think you do because you're using a plasma TV, but should you ever want to use a light gun, the light guns plug into the composite video port, but only use sync. So you could do this mod and still use light guns accurately if you got a CRT. So I think the question to you is, first of all, do you have your own skills or have a modder with the skills to work on a PlayStation? Because the PS2s are way more complicated than the consoles that preceded it. If so, awesome. Maybe just do the C-Sync mod. And on the other side of things, are you looking to add more than 8 consoles total to your SCART setup? And if the answer is yes, by far the easiest thing is just to get the latest G-SCART and make sure that the PlayStation cable is plugged into the newer Switch and everything else doesn't really matter. And that way you could just use the Switch that's built in, or the sync regeneration that's built in order to turn that sync on green automatically into RGBS. And that's pretty much it. So the problem isn't that with the OSSC, the problem is just that the G-SCART switch Lite didn't know what that RGSB signal was because there was no detection for it yet. So Super G was nice enough to implement all that into the latest version, and hopefully the explanation that I just spit out would be a good, at least point you in the direction of where you need to get started. Second switch or modding your PlayStation. So any other questions, please let me know, but hopefully that takes care of it. Oh, and one more thing, as Bad Reality pointed out, and another way to do it without modding anything or buying much of anything new is to just use your PlayStation 2 with component video. Make sure to get good quality cables, though, not the junk ones, and plug those into the component input of your OSSC. But that kind of defeats your purpose of having an all-automated setup. I just wanted to throw that in there because I believe, unless you could do the C-Sync mod yourself, that would be the next cheapest option, because the C-Sync mod, you either don't need any parts or you just need like a few resistors. So we're talking dollars worth of parts, not many dollars or even tens of dollars. So the next cheapest solution is just get component video cables, and you'd have to manually change inputs every time. But I just wanted to add that in. I know that's what you said you didn't want, but in case anybody else was listening, another solution for that is just go component, and you don't have to mod anything or even get another switch. You just have to manually go back and forth. And I believe you could even set your OSSC to auto detection, but I'm not sure how that would work with the G-SCART switch being on and the component video. You might as well just switch the inputs manually. Jake Lancaster had a question, but respectfully, I don't think you have 100% of the info. So I'll read through your question and then kind of go back and correct a little bit. But Jake wants to know if consoles that output odd signals. So generally speaking, 6th gen consoles, they weren't designed only for CRTs, and they weren't designed only for flat screens with HDMI output. It's that weird middle ground of Wii, GameCube, PS2, GameCube, and I'm sure I'm missing one. But with those consoles that output the weird signal, one of the many issues that you get is sometimes it's not truly 4:3. It's either a little too wide or a little too squished, depending on your TV's settings. And Jake's question was, with an XRGB Mini, there's modes that are able to correct this. But with OSSC users, I understand the OSSC to basically be a line multiplier, offering little in the way of image manipulation and correction. So that's actually totally wrong. The OSSC can do a lot, and the best way to get performance out of both the XRGB Mini and the OSSC is to download pre-configured profiles. Firebrand X has all of this on his website, ton of great stuff. So even on your existing XRGB Mini, FrameMeister, all the same thing, I would use these profiles, especially for these consoles, to clear all of these issues up. And same with the OSSC. You just load a PS2 profile and you get a pretty darn good presentation of the image. The only issue with the OSSC is its compatibility with certain TVs, because you're partially right in that it is a line multiplier and it doesn't have a frame buffer, which is why it's zero lag. So you can't re-encode some of the refresh rates or sync, which is why some TVs freak out about it. I'm kind of oversimplifying, but the whole point is the OSSC can manipulate the image a lot. And if you'd like to mess around with all the settings, you can. There's even that web interface now to make it easier. But I would just download the pre-made timings and tweak those as needed, because that takes care of everything. So hopefully that sums everything up. I was trying to make that as easy to understand without going deep down the rabbit hole of how these 6th gen consoles sometimes generated their signal. I could probably talk for an hour about that and only be 75% right. So I figured a general overview of this. And just another quick point I want to make that doesn't really have anything to do with your question, but you say you own a FrameMeister now and you're talking about the OSSC. The main two differences between them, three differences. The FrameMeister is compatible with everything, but it adds 1.5 frames of lag and doesn't process the colors as well as the OSSC does. The OSSC always keeps the colors in their original color space, but the OSSC is not compatible with every TV in every mode. So as a result of that, I don't ever really recommend people buy the FrameMeister anymore simply because of cost. It's really expensive. But if you've already invested in the FrameMeister and you have everything set up and working fine, I would say leave well enough alone unless lag really, really bothers you, because as you stated, you already have something that is able to correct everything you need. I would absolutely look into getting those custom profiles though, because it's free. All you need to do is buy an SD card, and it really changes the whole experience because everything is just as perfect as you could dial it in on that device. Robert Dickinson has another question about PS2s being modded for C-Sync. It's funny, I've barely heard anything about that in the past 2 years, and now we have 2 questions in the same Q&A. But question is, I've been using an older retro access PlayStation SCART cable, one with the 3 220 microfarad caps. You followed the PlayStation link to Dan's C-Sync page, and it looks like he's suggesting that LumaSync PS2 cable be modified. If you order a custom PS2 cable from Retro Access, what's the recommended build for a C-Sync modded PS2? So, if you haven't modded your PlayStation 2 yet, I would say hold off just a little bit longer, because that's one of the things I was trying to determine is which of these models require which changes. And the 2 PlayStation 2s that I had modded for C-Sync, output voltage that's a little too high. Not kill your OSSC too high, but it's not good practice to have them at 1 volt and above like that. It's better to lower it. So in that case, when you do the C-Sync mod, you would just have to add a surface mount resistor between those 2 spots, or maybe a through hole, depending on how far away the points are. The one that I recommend is you basically just take a component that's already there and bridge two spots with it. So if that's the case, all you would have to do is change that resistor. So basically, you open it up, you cut a couple of traces, you reroute some stuff, and then you add resistance to the output lines to keep that C-Sync voltage down. Now, if you'd already modded your PS2 and your voltage is too high, it's completely fine to just add another resistor in the SCART head to lower that voltage down. But it's my personal opinion that if people do these mods, why not just, since you're modding it anyway, put the correct components inside the console so you don't touch the cable? Because don't forget, I'm also looking ahead to what happens if, let's just say you get bored with this hobby, sell all your stuff, and then they resell it, and just grab any old SCART cable and plug it into a device, and the voltage is off. So I'm always kind of looking at the bigger picture of things. So if you have an oscilloscope, or if you have access to anybody that does, I would say just do this mod with them, because remember that you don't need any test patterns to test sync. You just need the console to be on. So you could have the PS2 all apart, outputting sync, and just measure it on the scope. And if it's over a volt, you need to add more resistance. And if it's under a volt, you don't. And don't take that advice for other consoles. If Steve were here, he'd be very upset at my generalizations. I'm specifically talking about the PS2 C-Sync mod. All you have to do is just follow the mod as Dan wrote it, and make sure you add enough resistance to lower the voltage down under 1 volt, under a 75 ohm termination load. So if you're not sure what those are, check out any of the scope videos that I did with Steve. That should make it easier. And, hopefully a lot more people will be buying scopes now, because while that $100 Owan scope that I got isn't exactly the best I've ever seen, it works perfectly for all of this stuff. So hopefully that's a help. But to reiterate the short answer to your question, my recommendation is having the mod tweaked so it outputs the correct voltage, and not tweaking the cable. But you could if you wanted to. You just would need to know how big a resistor you need to lower the voltage. So once again, still got to plug it into a scope to find out. Bad Reality had a whole bunch of questions regarding NES game cartridges. So basically, some NES game cartridges have capacitors in them, some have resistors, and of course, all capacitors will eventually go bad. And I've actually even seen a cartridge with a resistor that went bad. It was only one ever, but still. So the question is, Bad Reality is yet to see a good video detailing video game cartridge capacitor replacement. Do all NES carts use the same capacitors? I would say no. Do different cart have different capacitor replacements? Probably. Is this something I need to worry about in other video game cartridges? Open them up and see if they have caps in them. What are the symptoms of a failing capacitor in a video game cartridge? So all of these are general questions that apply to everything in gaming. The things that you need to remember are, I would say the number one most important thing you need to remember is capacitors fail in two ways. They just dry out and stop working, or they leak out. And that's the problem. The leaking capacitors, because when they leak, it leaks fluid onto the PCB that could eat through all the traces and kill whatever device that you have. So if this is something that's a very big concern for you, I would just very carefully, when you have spare time, open up your cartridges, open up your consoles, and visually look. And anything that's leaking, you got to change that cap out immediately. Anything that's not, if I were you, I would write down what capacitor level was in there. You could just read it right from the side. Get a pair of calipers if you want, just to make sure you get the right size. Those are cheap. You can get those for like $20. And just get a list together for yourself, and then swap them out whenever you're bored one day. I guess you could swap the resistor out as well, but I don't think there's any reason to unless something stops working. And, the signs of failing capacitors, other than it leaking out, is your game stops working. So it's not something I would worry about as much as a console, because there's less to worry about on a cartridge. I mean, if you just looked at a cartridge and its pins versus, a motherboard inside a console, or even inside a TV, it's quite a lot more to the other stuff. But I guess that's my general suggestion, is if it's something that you're worried about, pop them all open and visualize it. But so far, I haven't really heard too many people have horror stories about cartridges. It happens, but it's not nearly as widespread as things like Game Gears and Turbo Expresses and things like that. So I would just give it a shot if you had time, open them all up, and keep a good list. Another question from Bad Reality. Sony was a big proponent of Sync on Green, but do all of their BVMs and PVMs support this standard? So generally speaking, I wouldn't count on anything unless you read the spec sheet. But in the scenario that you're talking about, the only time in the retro gaming world you ever run into Sync on Green is PlayStation 2 in 480p. And nothing else. So that would actually limit the scope of your question, because then your question turns into, do all of their BVMs and PVMs that support 480p support Sync on Green? And I believe the answer to that question is yes. And the 20L5, I'm pretty sure does, but all of the D series and A series do. So that's definitely my assumption, in that if you find a tri-sync BVM or PVM, anyone that supports 480p, that it would support Sync on Green. Any older monitors, I wouldn't really count on it. And any other manufacturers, I really wouldn't count on it, just Sony. But once again, the only time you will ever run into Sync on Green in the retro gaming world in non-modded consoles is PlayStation 2, 480p only, not 240p or 480i. RetroB has a dangerous question about Mega Drive DIN outputs. I'm going to read your question, give the short version, and then explain, and I might bore everybody to death, but this involves console safety, so maybe suffer through it. The question is, are there differences between Mega Drive 2 or Genesis 2 9-pin mini-DIN cables that cause compatibility issues with non-Sega hardware? Recently noticed that 3DO RGB's 9-pin mini-DIN add-on only appears to support HD Retrovision cables, but why would that be? So is there a difference with non-Sega hardware? Yeah, massive safety-related difference. And the 3DO RGB is designed in a way to be completely safe. So while it only supports HD Retrovision cables, if you plugged a regular Genesis cable into it, nothing bad would happen. So let me explain. Sega, with the Master System and all versions of the Genesis, output a wrong RGB signal. The reason for that is because out of the millions of units shipped, only a handful used RGB, and even if it's 25 cents of components, 25 cents and millions starts to add up a lot. So they, to save cost, they didn't include them and put the components in the cable. And for something like a custom connector that's on a console, it's not that big a deal, because you always could just say, here's the cable standard for that console, and here, this is how you have to make it. Obviously it would always be better done on the board, but whatever, not that big a deal. But what that actually means is if you buy cables now from like AliExpress that don't have those components in them, you're outputting way too high a voltage to your equipment. And depending on the equipment, that could cause some serious problems or even short it out. So that's why anything that requires a 9-pin mini DIN that it's a Sega console, you have to buy cables from the reputable vendors. Retro Gaming Cables, Retro Access, Insurrection, of course, HD Retrovision, and even the Rad2X falls under this, because all of those devices have the components needed to lower the voltage and output the correct signal on the devices themselves. So when you have mods that use a 9-pin mini DIN that aren't a Sega console, you need to make sure that those mods also output the improper too high voltage so that you could use those standard cables with them. For a while there were consoles and mods that were custom that were using that DIN because it's cheap and easy to get, and telling people to use cables with no components in them, which is amazingly dangerous. The Omega MVS is one of those. I saw a lot of people using TurboGrafx 16s this way, and the problem that this introduces is, let's say you have one of these mods with the Genesis style DIN but a pass-through cable. Let's very common scenario. You get busy in life, you put all your stuff in a closet, you come back a year or two later, you grab what looks like a Genesis cable. The bottom part is Genesis, it's a SCART cable. By all means, it looks like a Genesis cable. You plug it into your Genesis, and now everything's wrong. All the image is too bright. Depending on the sensitivity of the equipment, you could be doing damage by feeding it too much voltage. It's a very realistic scenario that's happened to me even. Luckily, I was using it with equipment that didn't matter, but it just introduces a scenario that you could blow out equipment because you grabbed the wrong cable. So that's why good devices that insist on using the Genesis pinout, and for good reason too, you'd want to use it because you can get composite video and RGB out of the same DIN, and for things like HD Retrovision support. So devices like the SSDS3, Renee's DB graphics booster, and there's a few other stuff coming out pretty soon, all use the 9-pin mini DIN, and it all outputs the exact same way a Genesis does, which is wrong, but the end result is all of the cables that you have are correctly built cables, so no matter what console you plug them into, it doesn't matter. Now, to go back to what you talked about, the 3DO RGB, Dan used the 8-pin mini DIN because all of the attenuation is done on his mod. So that signal, that RGBS signal that's going out, is perfect just the way it is. So the 8-pin mini DIN is not a standard at all in gaming. The only device that used it previously is the XRGB Mini. So people just copied the pin out because now it's something easily Googleable, I guess is the best way that you could say it. And you just use a pass-through cable and you're done. So Dan recognized that a lot of people use only HD Retrovision cables, so he came up with an adapter that would be compatible with HD Retrovision. But it's the opposite of what I was warning people about. If you use a Genesis cable on a 9-pin mini DIN 3DO mod from Dan, it's dimmer. And, you could technically use that and turn your brightness up. It's not great, but it's not unsafe. And that is by far the most important thing. So if you only use HD Retrovision cables, get the 3DO with a 9-pin mini DIN, you could use those and it'll look perfect. If you accidentally plug in a Genesis cable into that, it just will be too dim. No harm will come to it, nothing else. So the reason I went on this long rant is just because if you see something with a 9-pin mini DIN, don't automatically assume that it is correctly outputting video, incorrectly or correctly, however you want to think about it. Just if it's a Sega console, I guess the best and simplest way to say it is if you see something with a 9-pin mini DIN, use a Genesis RGB cable with it. One of the good built ones that says Genesis 2 on it. And if there's a problem, look into the mod, look into the console, contact where you got it from to try to figure out what the issue is. But I wouldn't ever do the opposite. I would never grab a random 9-pin mini DIN cable and use it in anything unless it was specifically designed for it. because of this reason. You don't want to just grab an off-the-shelf 9-pin mini DIN cable, stick it into a Genesis, and then have too much voltage coming out. So hopefully that wasn't too long and rambly, but I try to be very clear when it comes to safety issues. And at the very least, the scenario you described, there's no safety issue. Even if you accidentally plug a Genesis cable into the 3DO, you're fine. So sorry for the rant, but I just want to make sure that nobody hurts any of their equipment, trying to make sure nobody loses money. Jason D asked if there's a way to connect a PS2 using component cables to the G-SCART switch. Wasn't there a pass-through adapter at some point like this one? So to answer your question, not the light, but the older ones and the newest ones. And that adapter might not fit. So let me elaborate a little bit. I think the original G-SCART switch would use, the original and the light would use sync to do its auto switching. So if it detected sync, it would switch to that port. And if it didn't detect sync, the original G-SCART switch would default to the port that's closest to the outputs. I can't remember if that was 1 or 8, but it's the one closest to the 2 output ports. The G-SCART switch light, if it doesn't detect sync, it just doesn't switch to an output. You could add a JTAG header and you could make your own switch for it to manually switch between ports, but as is, it wouldn't. The latest G-SCART switch, I believe, uses colors for the auto switching detection, meaning that this would work fine. So anything other than the light should work. Another point about these, we got ones sort of like this a while back, but then found it was really cramped. The cables on top were fine, but the cables in front, you almost couldn't use both SCART outputs at that point because the cables were so jammed in there. I even tried right angle connectors and stuff like that. So a better adapter would be a custom one from Retro Access that has like receptacle style component video dangling out. So, the YPB, PR, and then left and right, and then it plugs directly in. So it's kind of squid style, I guess. That way it wouldn't block any other ports and you could just plug whatever other cable into it. So overall, yes, you could do that, but there's really only very specific scenarios in which that's a good idea to mix. Because don't forget, whatever goes into the G-SCART comes out. So if you're using an OSSC or like a PVM, if most of your consoles are RGB and then you switch to the component console, you'll still have to go in and press the button to switch between RGB and component. And then when it goes back to RGB, vice versa. So at the moment, it's really there, you really have to think about your whole setup and see if this is worth it to you, because any kind of custom adapter like this is going to cost money. And if you have a bunch of component video sources, it might actually be easier overall to get like a G-Comp switch and then that component to RGB transcoder from RetroTink so that you could have a fully automated setup and never switch a button. But to answer your direct question, I don't think it works on the light, but I think it'll work on the original G-SCART and the newest, the one that's just called G-SCART switch. And you could really look into the pass-through adapter to make sure it fits. But once again, like, look at your whole setup scenario and see if this is the best solution for you. 8% Android had an interesting question. They just got a Mister and wanted to connect it to a PVM. They have the HD Retrovision RCA cables, so would a VGA to component adapter do? And if so, do I have any recommendations? So the easiest thing in the world would be to get a cable from Amazon that's VGA on one side and YPB PR on the other. Once again, no conversion. It's just it just passes the signal. But the problem is I've seen a few of those that aren't really shielded very well, so the quality is less than. So you could do what you said and use the HD Retrovision RCAs and just get one of those short adapters that's like, it's a VGA end and then it dangles out the 3 RCA connectors. And even if they're not fully shielded, it's so short, it's going to be less interference than the longer one. Or of course, you could just order a VGA to SCART cable that's designed for the Mister that once again just passes the signals through. So I would choose whatever's the easiest for your solution and kind of just go from there, because there's a few ways to go about it. And don't forget, with the Mister, you have to edit the INI file and flip the switch to go back between RGB and component. But yeah, it's kind of, I wish there was easier ways to get some of the cable adapters for it, and maybe I don't know, maybe someday the Mr. crew will put on a separate 8-pin mini DIN cable for SCART and then have different outputs. But for now, the I/O board that's there works great. You just have to kind of figure out these adapter solutions and figure out whichever one's best for you. Adam Cameron wants to know what I think of that $23 DB graphics booster ripoff that's on eBay. And I strongly believe that nobody should use that thing. I bought it years ago when I first saw it, and I kind of had a laugh with Renee about the terrible knockoff that it was. And it was really bad. Components were on backwards. I mean, it's borderline dangerous to use. And then I bought one a year or two after that, and they'd at least fixed the orientation of stuff, and it was improved, but it's still a cheap, lower quality knockoff of Renee's. And then when I did that PC Engine for 2019 video, that seller even commented on the video and admitted that it's a knockoff of Renee's. I pinned the comment. I'm not sure if it's still there, but everything about that thing makes me want to avoid it. So you never know what quality you're going to get from a seller that's willing to sell something that bad, even if they corrected it. I mean, it should have never been sold that way in the first place. And it's still a knockoff. It's still a stolen design where people just said, oh, look at this. I'll try to make the same thing and try to copy the design, but cut corners to make it cheaper. Well, when you cut corners, this is what you get. You get a much lower quality product that doesn't put out as good a signal. So no, I would avoid that like the plague. If you're looking to save money, if you need a low cost but safe solution, the one that's on the market now, I believe the eBay seller, the Foo, has a cable with everything built in. So you plug it into the PC Engine or TurboGrafx. The video circuit is on the console side of things, which is good. That's the way that you want it. And then the other end of it's a SCART head, so you don't need to then buy a SCART cable. And I think overall, that's the cheapest version. I think the graphics booster is the next cheapest, assuming you already have a Genesis 2 RGB cable. And I believe there's something coming early next year that's designed to shut these people down, basically. Basic RGB output, excellent quality, no extra features, just inexpensive, and that should be coming first quarter of next year. But that's if you want the most affordable options. For now, grab the graphics booster or go back and watch that video and see if any of the solutions that are out there work best for you. But avoid that one on eBay like the plague. Well, that's it for this week. As always, thanks so much to everybody who participates in these. And if you're new to all of these, just find whatever is the newest Q&A post wherever it is that you support and ask any question at all that you would like right there. The way these work, I can't really go back and sift through other comments on other videos. Pretty much once I'm done shooting the video, I don't really go back and look at the other ones. So if I've missed your question, it's either by mistake or because you posted the question after I started shooting this and maybe forgot to refresh the page. So please, just any question at all you have, the newest Q&A post, just post it right there, and I try to get to them every Friday. Sometimes it's Thursday, sometimes it's late Friday night, but usually the cutoff, like if you really have a question that you want answered, I would get it in before Thursday afternoon, Eastern time, I guess, and kind of just go from there. But thank you so much for all of your help and support, and I'll see you next time.